program discussions that we had a few months ago. The second part is going to be support for applications. So we'll have staff available to help out with any applications from 3 to 6. But this first hour here is going to be talking about the agricultural conservation programs. Tomorrow, we'll have a couple workshops, and I actually have that labeled wrong on my agenda there, so sorry about that. For tomorrow, we have 2 workshops planned. From 9 to 10:30, we'll be talking about the municipal conservation programs, and from 10:30 to 12, we'll be talking about the industrial conservation program. So lots of things, but we'll get through it all. For meeting logistics, just really quickly, we do have a webinar going. I'm not using a microphone. If you can speak kind of loudly like me so that anyone on the webinar might be able to hear you, that would be helpful. We are with the agricultural and municipal industrial programs with this management plan development. We're looking for your ideas. We're down here because we want to hear from you all. So I do really appreciate you all being here. And I hope that you'll be able to be thoughtful and collaborative about the type of things that we're able to develop for this program. Thanks. Before I start here, I'll do a quick introduction of the staff that we have here. My name is Natalie Mast. I'm the Active Management Areas Director at ADWR. To my left, I have Brandon Thalman. He is our data specialist. He's kind of our guru for all things applications. Madison Moreno is our AMA establishment coordinator. So she is helping out with all of the logistics of this whole process, which is a lot. So thank you, Madison. You guys, I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of Madison. We also have Lainey Meeker at the table here. She is our statewide programs supervisor. We have Mary Wirtz. Mary is our industrial data specialist in the AMA, so she's going to help out with the workshops tomorrow. And we have Casey Allman, who is our brand new AMA establishment supervisor. Sorry, I'm struggling with the titles today. Casey this is your second week. Third week. So Casey is brand new. We're really grateful that he was willing to make the trek down with us today. All right. So a couple reminders before we get into the ag stuff. This is related to the Douglas Active Management Area. Douglas was the first subsequent AMA ever, and also the first designated by local election. The AMA was created on December 1st, 2022. So as we talk about a lot of these timelines, that December 1st, 2022 date is the starting date for a lot of things associated with the establishment timelines, but we use a different date for a lot of things related to applications, and Brendan will talk about that a little bit later. A portion of the AMA was previously an INA. This is something that's important to note. You can see a little bit, I know it's a little bit hard to see on this map, but there's this dotted line here that was the INA. The statutes related to AMAs require that AMAs are based on basin boundaries. So with the vote, the AMA is slightly broader than the previous INA was. For the management plan timeline, by statute, we are required to promulgate or formally adopt a management plan within 2 years of the creation of the AMA. So 2 years after December 1st of 2022, which is coming up more rapidly than I would like. So we are currently working through a process to develop all of the details for a management plan. Today, like I said, we'll follow up on the agriculture. We'll begin some development for municipal and industrial sectors. Or tomorrow we'll do the municipal and industrial part. And in the future, we'll have additional meetings to cover other topics, things like recharge and other things that may need to be discussed as a part of the management plan. We do intend to publish draft regulatory language for that management plan kind of in the late spring. That is something we've done for other management plans in the past and something that we got really good feedback on. It allows you all to see what that formal language would be about what those regulatory requirements are ahead of formal hearing processes. It allows a little bit more back and forth, a little bit more feedback and engagement in that process. Once we get through all of that, we will have to start a legal adoption process for the management plan. That process has statutory timelines associated with it. So once we get into that, it'll be more of a formal process where there are formal comment periods and formal deadlines and everything. For now, we're in what we refer to as an informal part of that process, where we're really just developing the concepts that will go into that plan. Brandon will talk about this shortly, but I would be remiss if I didn't take every single opportunity I could get to emphasize this deadline. We do have a March 1st, 2024 deadline for the Douglas AMA for all grandfathered rights applications. So that's type 1s, type 2s, and the irrigation grandfathered rights all must be submitted by March 1st. Excuse me, sorry.
Did you just say type 1, type 2 irrigation?
So type 1s and type 2s are non-irrigation rights, and irrigation grandfathered rights must also be submitted by that date. That date is a hard deadline. I think most of you have heard me say this a couple dozen times at least, but again, I'll always emphasize it when I get the chance. That date is a hard deadline, and ADWR is not able to make any exceptions to that deadline.
So type 1 and type 2 set of non-irrigation.
Non-irrigation.
What could you describe those types?
Sure. And that's something, Brandon, is that something that you have as a part of your?
I think so.
Okay. I might not want to get too far into that just to make sure we're saving time for the ag discussion. Very generally, they tend to be industrial types of uses. So
It's not residential.
Not residential, no. Yeah. I think Brandon on his slides has a definition of exempt wells. An exempt well is 35 gallons per minute or less, is not irrigating 2 or more acres of land, and is not using more than 10 acre-feet for some non-irrigation use, usually like a commercial type use. If you can check all 3 of those boxes, that well is exempt, which means it's not required to have a grandfather right to withdraw water from it, and it's not required to meter a report. So most of your domestic residential type uses will fall into that category. All right, so active management areas. Active management areas are a part of this structure. I think most of you have seen this slide before, but I'll go over it really briefly. The 1980 Groundwater Management Act created an additive structure for water regulation, groundwater regulation in the state. So we have certain requirements that apply statewide, such as the registration of all wells. We have certain additional requirements that apply inside irrigation non-expansion areas, such as the as a prohibition on the expansion of irrigated acres and requirements related to measuring and reporting. And then additional requirements apply inside of the AMA. So inside an AMA, you do have to register your wells. There is an irrigation non-expansion provision, and you have to measure and report. And also we have things like management goals, management plans, conservation programs, assured water supply, requirements for grandfathered rights, etc. The management goal, the management plan, and the conservation programs all kind of fit together. The idea is that a management goal is kind of an overarching theme that we're working toward. The management plan fills in some of the details of what are the strategies we want to use to get there. And the conservation programs are the tool that reduces withdrawals of groundwater in order to move toward the management goal. So much of what we're going to be talking about with this agricultural conservation program, and then tomorrow with the medium industrial, those are a part of the management plan. Those are the conservation programs that are required to be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater in order to move toward that management goal. I mentioned this timeline earlier. The Douglas AMA was created on December 1st, 2022. By statute, we are supposed to adopt a management plan within 24 months after, within 2 years after the creation of an AMA. And so our kind of deadline for this management plan is December 1st of this year. With conservation requirements in a management plan, there is a lag between when a plan is adopted and when those requirements become effective. That's a 2-year lag. So the first potential date that those conservation requirements would become effective is for the 2027 reporting year, because we would shift it to the beginning of the next reporting year. All right, so here's where we're at. Right now, we are in the development process for that management plan. We are here to hold kind of this development process, to hold a series of public meetings, to develop concepts, develop ideas for what conservation programs should look like for the Douglas AMA. I think we recognize that Douglas is unique in a lot of ways. And so a lot of what we're really hoping to do is create something that reflects that, something that could match what we have in the other AMAs, or it could be different depending on whether those tools that we have for the other AMAs fit for here or not. The initial management plan, like I said, with that statute, a conservation program does have to be designed to reduce withdrawals of groundwater. So that's kind of our one strict requirement for conservation programs, reducing groundwater withdrawals. But we kind of expect that this is going to be a transitional plan. AMAs are complex, and we understand that there's going to be some transition time here where folks are kind of learning about what this structure is and what's required here. So we want to make sure that we are educating folks on what those requirements are, what the processes are, and start to introduce some basic conservation requirements that can be built on over time. So with that, we'll kind of circle back to some of the conversation that we had in our agricultural workshop a few months ago, back in, was that November? Okay. It doesn't feel like that long ago. So part of the discussion that we had back in November was, would the tools that we have for the initial AMAs work here? Why or why not? And what types of characteristics would need to be specific to Douglas for a conservation program? So we talked through the base program, which is our allotment style program. We calculate a water duty, we multiply it by a number of acres, and that's the allotment for that irrigation grandfathered right. That's our default program for folks. We also have optional programs like the Best Management Practices program and the Integrated Farm program. There are other types. We also have a historic cropping program that we tend to ignore because nobody has ever participated in it in the other AMAs. So we really kind of found that one to be of pretty limited applicability. So what we heard in that workshop in November was that there was some interest in potentially having some kind of a tiered approach for the agricultural conservation program, for that base allotment style program, where there was some acknowledgement in that calculation of different sizes of farms, maybe acknowledgement of higher consumptive use and putting kind of some downward pressure on those higher water users, recognition in the differences between cover and double cropping, considering bleaching, those types of things. The base program includes assigned irrigation efficiencies, scientific consumptive use data, and can consider leaching and other needs. So what we committed to doing at that last meeting was taking some of that back and bringing back a first stab at something. So I hope I'm going to show something on the next slide, and I hope you all will take that for what it is, that it's a first attempt at something. And we're here really hoping for feedback on that first attempt. I want to emphasize what I just said there, that I don't want you to assume that this is a final version. I think we're looking for feedback on different components of this and whether this is the right fit for this area. So what we kind of came up with is a little bit of a hybrid between tiers based on acreage and tiers based on consumptive use. So the idea here is that total acreage of a farm will be used to kind of categorize that farm into a tier. But if the water duty is based on high water use crop, that farm would automatically go into that highest tier level. So what we're kind of proposing, and again, these are initial numbers open to feedback. We can certainly consider adjusting these if these are not quite the right numbers for this area, is basically that tier 1 would be farms that are 10 to 50 acres, and they would be set at an 80% irrigation efficiency. Tier 2 would be farms that are between 50 and 100 acres, and they would be set at an 83% irrigation efficiency. And then any farms greater than 100 acres or crops with a consumptive use of greater than 4.5 acre feet per acre would be set at 85% irrigation efficiency. So I want to emphasize that 4.5 number. When we talk about consumptive use is just the amount that the plant is using. So typically consumptive use is divided by an irrigation efficiency to get a water duty, for example, an acre foot per acre number. So,
quick question.
Sure.
What source would you guys be using to determine the crops consumptive use? Like, are you using University of Arizona, where it says a corn plant needs?
It would be something along those lines. We haven't specifically yet identified what data source we're going to be using, but we're going to be relying on some sort of scientific published literature. Yeah. So 4.5. Oh, I had this number in my head and I've lost it. Sorry. 4.5 acre feet per acre at an 85% irrigation efficiency comes to about 5.3 acre feet per acre. So that 4.5 number is actually something that did come from the other AMAs. That number was used as a part of the early management plans in the other AMAs to establish as a category for high water use crops, as a threshold for high water use crop category. So again, kind of an initial proposal. I know I'm throwing a lot at you right now. Are there any questions about this before I move on? Go ahead.
Assigned irrigation efficiency means, for instance, if it's 80% that you would be reducing by 20%?
No, so that is a piece of the calculation. So the way we establish water duties for a farm is we look at the crop that was historically grown on those acres. And by historically, I mean the 5 years prior to the call for the election. So 5 years prior to August 30th of 2022, we look at the crops that were grown in that time period. We take some kind of literature value for consumptive use for those, and we divide that by an assigned irrigation efficiency. So the higher the irrigation efficiency, the lower the ultimate water duty.
Explain the math there, maybe with an example, if you're using.
Sure. So with this 4.5 piece, sorry, I'm pulling up my calculator here. So 4.5 acre feet per acre at a 80% irrigation efficiency comes out to 5.6 acre feet per acre. That would be your kind of application. So irrigation efficiency, you're kind of assuming 20% is lost either to evaporation or infiltration. At 85% irrigation efficiency, a 4.5 consumptive use, comes to 5.3 acre feet per acre. So it's an inverse relationship where the higher your irrigation efficiency, the lower your application rate or your water duty.
Say water duty, that's the amount of water that we are allowed to use to irrigate a crop.
So that would be, so, yeah, yes, sort of. Water duties are multiplied by a number of acres, the water duty acres, to create a total allotment for that piece of land. That allotment can be used within those legally irrigable acres as you see fit. We're not going to come in and say you're only allowed to apply 5.3 acre feet to this acre right here. It's for that unit you could use, so say you had 5.3 acre feet per acre and 10 acres you could irrigate. You would have 53 acre feet to do with, to water as you wanted to across your 10 acres.
So I think I understand now. You're saying your crop uses 4.5 acre feet per acre, but irrigation efficiency rate 85%. So you actually need to increase the water duty such that you have enough total water to actually.
Right, because some is going to be lost to evaporation.
Okay, I see.
Yes. So, go ahead, Ron.
How are you measuring your efficiency? Just off our annual water report? You have to have a crop report?
So these irrigation efficiencies aren't necessarily based on what is being measured on farm, for example. And that's why they're called assigned irrigation efficiencies. These irrigation efficiencies are really just a tool within that calculation to help kind of ensure irrigation efficiencies. So we have some kind of literature research values around different irrigation methods and the expected irrigation efficiencies that you would get out of a given irrigation method. What we've seen for the Douglas AMA is that Douglas, on average, is between 80 and 85% irrigation efficiency right now.
So how do you know if I'm planting corn with small grains this year? Do you get my efficiency from the total water I get here?
So the idea here is not that it would be based on your actual efficiency, right? So say you were growing corn, I forget what the consumptive, I used to know more of these numbers off the top of my head. You could choose to grow corn and we would calculate, so if you were growing corn in the 5 years prior to the establishment of the AMA, we would calculate your water duty based on that literature value about the consumptive use of corn divided by, say you were doing 75 acres, we would do it divided by 0.83 and
No worries.
total number. And then you would be able to use that water on that total number, that allotment, across your acres to water your corn. There are also flexibility accounts. Say there were fluctuations from year to year, we would be able to account for that. We can provide more information about those flex accounts maybe at a future meeting. So basically what the allotment does, what this calculation does, is it creates the structure by which we calculate that allotment. The allotment is the volume that you are allowed to use on those acres in a given year, but there are also flexibility provisions where you can go higher or lower in any given year and kind of have it level out.
So if I were filling up my, it would behoove me to let you know I irrigated corn as opposed to small grains. And how do you know if you get the application on corn and I'm doing the small grains?
So two things there. I understand why you're asking the question. Two things there though. One is that you are signing that the information on that application is correct. So I would not recommend that you falsify the information that you're.
Alfalfa for 3 years, corn 3 years, and small grains 3 years.
Then you should put that all on the application. There are separate lines for
I
each
can
of
base
them.
my allotment.
It would be, sure. It would be kind of a prorated average of the 3 different crops.
So that's where your flex comes in, right? You got 5 years and he's doing corn for say a year or two. Right?
If you,
It's a small drain which consumes less water. So we look at that 5 years, allow X amount of acre feet for that 5 years, as long as it evens out into the 5 years.
in most cases,
Example, this property that didn't irrigate, you irrigated a month before the call for election. So you have very little water. How are you gonna assign it? You want that?
yeah. It would still be based on the crop.
Small ground.
So we would look at the consumptive use specifically for the crop type, not necessarily the amount of water that was historically grown on that acreage.
All right, so that sets my crop irrigation. And what if I want to grow higher use on that property? I have the history for it.
Right.
Sure.
So there are provisions in an AMA, and this kind of gets into the flex accounting side of things. There are provisions in an AMA where you can purchase flex credits, either from another parcel that you might own or from somebody else that has available credits. That might be something that we'll have to go into in more detail, in more detail in another presentation. I can make a note of that to bring more information about that. Yes.
On the irrigation efficiency,
Yes.
so flooding would have a very low flood, if you flood irrigated, you'd have a low 27 or 80, 70%.
Yeah, depending on how it's managed, we often see
So the
65 to 80.
Someone has a pivot, their efficiency possibly would be 85%, but if the crop was flooded, the efficiency is going to be less.
What we've seen is there's not a lot of flood irrigation in this area, which is part of, there is some, but there's not much. And that's part of why the average irrigation efficiencies here are so high, is because there isn't that much flood irrigation here. We do have a process for potential exceptions. If someone has if someone has some kind of extenuating circumstance where they don't believe those conservation requirements are reasonable for them, we do have processes for individual exceptions. Those are called variance if it's a temporary thing, or administrative review if it's kind of a longer term thing.
So if all you irrigate 5 years with small drains, that's all you're ever gonna be able to.
Yes, and that's part of the statutory structure here, is that the water duties are to be based on the crops historically grown on that acreage. And by historically grown, that specifically references that 5-year period prior to the, in this case, the quote.
So if you just started forming a pivot within the time frame to get your water a lot, like you have small drainage and cover crop, you're not gonna get much water.
And that's part of the statutory structure here. Yeah,
Thank you.
good questions. So what,
Doesn't really make any sense to me at all. You're basing your regulatory decisions upon the number of acres and water consumption. So, is this a blanket regulatory tool for the entire AMA region, or is that localized in different areas? So, what I'm trying to say is, I have 56 acres, and I irrigate that on average of 180 acre feet a year. And looking at the historical data on the water, the aquifer level, is stabilized. So it doesn't really make any difference how much irrigation water I use or how many acres I use. If the aquifer is stabilized, it doesn't go down, how can you justify saying how much water I can use and how much I can't based upon the number of acres and the amount of water you get the water? That's what we're attempting to accomplish, to stabilize the aquifer and not let it drop anymore.
so what we've seen in the Douglas AMA on average is that about twice as much water is being pulled out of the aquifer than is being replenished on an annual basis.
I'm sorry.
About twice as much water is being removed from the aquifer than is being replenished into the aquifer on an annual basis.
Not ours.
In 20?
I got you.
On the basin scale, on average.
Well, in my aquifer, 20,
So
2020,
the way ADWR treats groundwater basins,
it measured at 71 feet, 74 feet. In 2022, it measured at 71 feet, so it came up 4 feet. And in 2023, still at 71 feet, so it stabilized. And I used the exact same amount, basically average of so many acre feet a year. So if I'm not pulling my aquifer down, why do I need any regulations on it at all?
the AMA requirements apply at the basin scale. ADWR's responsibility, ADWR's requirement is that we implement the statutes as they're written. And so the way this is designed is that conservation requirements apply basin-wide. ADWR treats the basin as a whole. And there are going to be differences in localized water levels. That's part of the reality of a groundwater basin. It's not just a bathtub and it doesn't all stay flat across the entire basin. You're going to have areas that are different from each other depending on the local conditions. And the basin itself is still interconnected. And what one person does in one area might eventually affect others in other areas. And so we're really looking at this as a whole. So I understand what you're saying, and also the conservation requirements do apply within the boundaries of the active management area.
One quick question.
Sure.
You say that the aquifer has gone down by X number of feet over what time frame?
So I don't actually have those numbers off the top of my head. The number that I quoted was that about twice as much water is being pulled out of the aquifer right now as is being put back each year.
So what's the time frame they determine how much of water is going back into the aquifer? The last 5 years is way different than the last 20 years.
I believe for that analysis, we looked at about a 30-year time period.
Thank you.
What about a geological evaluation of where the source is to recharge water?
Sure.
So over on the east side of the AMA, the source of recharge for the aquifer comes from a totally different place than the recharge from the aquifer on the west side of the AMA. So where do you make these determinations as to where the source of regeneration of the aquifer?
So
where do you make that determination to come from?
ADWR is working on a groundwater model to better characterize how and where groundwater is replenished in the AMA, how and where water is being removed from the aquifer in the AMA. That is relevant and helpful and important to know. And it doesn't change the fact that conservation requirements apply to all non-exempt well users within the AMA.
This map you drew up with the boundary, does that include the whole bowl? Or just the area that's bound by the boundaries for the measurement and for the water problem?
So the boundary here is the groundwater basin boundary that was defined by ADWR in the 1980s. When in the 1980s, I'm sorry.
Isn't the underwater bowl bigger than the boundary?
I'm not really sure what you mean by that.
It goes into Mexico, doesn't it?
Oh, so active management areas are part of an Arizona law.
Right,
Arizona has authority within the state of Arizona.
right.
So we will, as we create that groundwater model that I mentioned, we're certainly going to evaluate what the flow patterns are on the other side of the border, but where we have legal authority for things like conservation programs and that type of thing is only within the state of Arizona.
That I understand, but I don't understand is, if Mexico takes up more water than we do, then the water's gonna go down without us doing it. Correct?
The active management area exists, and ADWR's responsibility is to implement the
Within
statutes
the
and the structures that exist.
In other words, we can be penalized for somebody else taking the water from the same bowl, even though it's not regulated.
We don't have any authority to regulate water
Correct.
users in Mexico. What we can control and what we can contribute to solutions on is the geographic area within the state of Arizona.
Okay, I guess my main question is, how can you assume that we are actually drawing more water? Do you take the measurements from the measuring devices, or do you actually measure the height of the water level?
That'll all be evaluated as a part of that groundwater model that's being developed.
Okay, but it's, you understand where I'm coming from, right?
I do, and also, like I said, there's
Nothing we can do about that side.
we have authority within the state of Arizona.
We'll run out of water and somebody else wants to use it. Okay, thank you.
When you're doing your modeling, you and just basically.
So ADWR, in the context of active management areas, focuses on groundwater. So we look at groundwater basins. Watersheds are defined a little bit differently because it's more focused on surface flows instead of groundwater. So for that groundwater model, we will focus on this groundwater basin as defined.
You'll just look within the Douglas Basin at volumes of and groundwater levels. Is all you can look at.
Yes, with the exception, in certain cases, there is some kind of connectivity between groundwater basins. If there's transmission between Douglas and Wilcox, I think it's small if my memory serves, but I'm certainly not the expert there, and that's something that'll be evaluated as.
My issue there is Whitewater Draw. Its headwaters is Rucker Canyon and top of the Chiricahuas, which is a whole lot more acreage than just the Douglas Basin. And how does that water get California? It's like the water basin, not how much is coming in on the watershed and getting to this.
So we look at anything that could be an inflow or outflow to the aquifer. So if that water would reach the aquifer, it would be something that would be accounted for as a part of that groundwater model.
I think I need to talk to her.
Probably. All right. What I'll note here is that this structure was based on feedback from a previous conversation that we had down here. I think it's something that could be productive for this area. I think it's something that was an interesting idea that came out of those discussions. And I'd be curious if you guys had any thoughts on the values here, whether this is the right structure, whether we're way off base here. You don't necessarily have to answer all of those questions right now. We will be taking comments on this and also on the municipal and industrial discussions that we'll be having tomorrow until the 23rd. Thank you, Madison. I meant to put that on this slide and I obviously forgot. 23rd, it was on this slide. Yes.
So once the plan's implemented, if you accept the structure that you have there, how often do you review it and modify it to adapt to changing environments? How do you find it?
So the proposed management goal included a 10-year cycle for management plans.
So you monitor for 10 years and then come back to the public and make another plan?
Exactly. To either maintain or. All right. Next on the list, we talked about best management practices, we talked about the integrated farm program, and we talked about the historic cropping program. As a reminder, the integrated farm program was still, thank you, was still an allotment style program. But it allowed, so for example, if you have an irrigation grandfathered right here and an irrigation grandfathered right here, you can apply for the integrated farm program and report on those two IGFRs together, use the water from those two IGFRs across those two farm units, kind of divvy up however makes most sense for you. And kind of as a trade-off for being able to move the water around in that way, there is in the other active management areas, 5%, what we call cut to the aquifer, a 5% cut to the total allotment. But it allows ease of reporting and greater flexibility with how and where the water is used. So for example, if you wanted to change from your small grains to a higher variety crop, you could consider entering that integrated farm program and fallowing a portion of a different field or moving water from a different field over to support that watering on.
If you had five pivots in small greens, that's what your allotment was based on. You could turn around.
I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but something like that in concept. Yeah. So what we heard about the integrated farm program was that folks had an interest in including that program in the management plan for Douglas. It seemed like that type of flexibility was something that was desirable for this area.
Yeah, that'd be a must for me at least.
Thank you. The best management practices program was one where if a farm complies with a specific set of best management practices, they could be exempt from water duties. What we heard, at least from the last workshop, was that that type of a program might not really be consistent with what we're trying to do in this basin. And it seems to make more sense to have kind of total water use limits for folks. Yes.
Your best management practices you're talking about integrate with ACDW or farm performance best management practices?
It's been a long time since I've looked at theirs.
And it's just environmental quality reporting, and now we're going to have to work. That's management practice reporting.
So the BMP program is an optional program. So that allotment style program is the default. You would automatically be in what we call the base program. The integrated farm program, the BMP program are optional programs. So ones that you could choose to participate in if we had them in the management plan and if you applied for and opted into it.
So with your best management program, what does that actually look like? Are you guys looking at certain technologies? Describe to me what you're looking at to check
Sure.
that.
So in the other AMAs, so the reason I'm saying that is a best management practices program is something that's written into the management plan. So the precise requirements could theoretically be different here than they might be in the other AMAs. In the other AMAs, the structure is there are 4 categories of requirements, and you have to obtain a minimum number of points from each category and a minimum number of total points in order to be in compliance with the program. Those include things like lighting ditches. You get more points in certain categories for efficient irrigation technologies, things like center pivots. you get more points in certain categories for specific management practices that might ultimately save water. What's the fourth category? Education is that's, I'm missing one. Oh boy. I got a lot of that off the top of my head.
Basically, it's a point system. You go through what your technologies, what your habits are.
Right.
And if you meet certain criteria, you get points towards that. And how does that regulate our water?
It's the intent of the program is that it was designed to kind of push toward more efficient use of water. I think some of the hesitation for this area in particular is that this area is already quite efficient. And so kind of to your point, it might not be the right fit for this area because this area is already quite efficient and it's not necessarily going to have that downward pressure in the same way here.
So did I understand correctly when you're talking about the best management practices, that if you, I guess, check a certain number of boxes for different implementations you're using in this category, that there are no designated allotments, that you're allowed to use whatever water?
That's what the structure is in the other ANAs, yes.
So how you gonna, what are you gonna measure water when feet wise? What's the
Sorry.
license? Is that
So-
your
So water use from non-exempt wells in an AMA is required to be measured across the board, whether it's for irrigation use or not. So that's kind of a separate requirement from this conservation program.
is this gonna be the farmer's responsibility to spend thousands of dollars buying, water meters?
So
And
with,
anybody that's been around the water meter, if they're not pumping full pipes of pressure, if they're pumping any air, cascading water or anything from a well, you're not getting accurate readings by no means.
so for lands that were previously in the IMA, those were already required to be measured. There were already metering requirements for the IMA. So for much of the AMA, that's not a new requirement. For those areas that were outside where the previous IMA boundaries were, yes, they're required to meter their withdrawals. There are alternative methods for measuring those withdrawals, including things like power readings and that kind of thing, but most of those require that you take some kind of a flow measurement to be able to correlate the power readings with actual water use.
So can you do actually, what comes, it gets on the ground? In other words, put the meters on your field, or when your sprinkler comes over, it'll tell you how many inches.
Typically, it's more well metering or at the point of delivery type of metering.
Any of the electrical or the meters, if you're pumping any cascading water, air, they are not accurate. But I guess that's, okay.
I'm certainly not a meter expert. We do have folks that know a lot more than I do about all of that. But what I will say is that there are accuracy requirements for meters. I don't remember off the top of my head what those requirements are, but it is something that is supposed to be checked and maintained over time.
In the AMA, I understood that they had to use meters out of the well. But I'm hearing we can still use the alternative methods.
So there are, yes, so there are alternative measurement methods. We often say metering and recording as kind of an offhand, but the more accurate term is really measuring and recording. So there are alternative methods like power readings, like I think gas is one of them. There's a number of different approved alternative methods for getting those meters. Oh, yes.
When the gentleman was talking about cascading and airflow, he didn't want to say that the meter was wrong or inaccurate. But if you get half the flow, you're measuring only that flow and the top half is air. So technically, you're actually, because of that half water, half air, you're actually measuring for the whole pipe when you're or half a meter, shall I say.
So
Cascading and
surgery.
Sure, and perhaps that's something where an alternative method instead of a meter might be a better fit, because you would be required to take some kind of a flow measurement to correlate your power readings with the actual flow.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. Yep, good call. There we go. Getting mixed up on which buttons I'm pushing here. All right. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the integrated farm program. We talked a little bit about the BNP program, the historic cropping. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
I love all this technology, but I'm a paper person. Do you have that printed out somewhere that I can jot notes on that?
We do not have that today. We will have this on our website within probably a day or two. But no, we don't have printouts available today. So BNP program, we talked about historic cropping program. I mentioned this just really briefly. This is something that was required to be included in the management plans for the initial AMAs. It's a pretty limited applicability program. We've never had a participant in it in the other 5 AMAs, so we thought it was worthwhile to mention, but we are proposing to exclude that from the Douglas management plan.
I didn't hear that. You're gonna exclude what from the Douglas?
It's called the historic, where did it go? Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. There we go. The historic cropping program. And it's a program that looks at crops and irrigation efficiencies a little bit differently, but with much more limited flexibility provisions and additional reporting requirements. And part of the reason that we propose to exclude it is that we've never in the history of the program had a single person opt into it. And so we just don't think the applicability is really there. All right. The additional types, I know we're running a little bit short on time, and I want to make sure I hand things over to Brandon on time. The other types of feedback that we're still really looking for this area is, are there other goals and characteristics that conservation programs for Douglas should have? We are really hoping to get additional feedback from you all. And I appreciate some of the questions that you all have asked throughout this time, because it helps me better understand. One second. It helps me better understand what we should be clarifying and what we should be looking into. I appreciate the feedback. We would love to have additional ideas from you all, either in side conversations. You can email them to us by February 23rd. But as I showed on that timeline at the beginning, we do have to start moving on actually finalizing some of this language so that we can write it into a formal document and get that adopted by the end of this year to our statutory deadline. So maybe I'll just leave that at that. We would love to have additional comments. Ron, you had a question.
I just had one question. In the Whitewater Wildlife area,
Yes.
they pump an awful lot of water into the pump. How are they gonna be regulated?
So that is a category that would fall under, they're a type 2. They're a non-irrigation use. So that is actually something we'll be discussing as a part of our, most likely our industrial conservation program. So they would be subject to grandfathered rights. I think they already applied for a type 2, which is a non-irrigation type of grandfathered right. And there can be specific types of what we refer to as industrial conservation requirements for other types of water users that are non-irrigation. Our definition of industrial is pretty much anything that doesn't fall under municipal or agriculture. So industrial is a broad category that can include things like the whitewater.
They pump a lot of water. Oh, full capture over at there.
Go back first.
So the conservation program, are they gonna get credit for water that they can get extra? Is that what you're saying?
There are, in the existing conservation programs and the other AMAs, there are some flexibility provisions where if you use less water one year, you might be able to use more water in a future year. That's certainly something that we can consider for this area. For the agricultural-based program, those are written into statute, and we can certainly describe some of those again. I'll take one last question, and then I want to make sure I'm handing things off to Brandon on time here.
And maybe if you're gonna address this later, but I know it's more appropriate to the meeting tomorrow about industrial use, but it's gonna impact agriculture at the end of the day. The supply and demand report you guys just put out estimates a possible increase in the water use for mining of 12,150 acre feet per year. And I'm wondering if it's possible that an AMA management plan can put some conservation limits on how much new water is able to be used for mining operations.
That is a better conversation for that industrial conservation program thing. In the other active management areas, we do have specific conservation kind of subsector programs specific to mining, and I'm sure that is something that we would probably consider for this area as well. Good. All right. So like I said, any additional comments can be sent to us. Management plans at azwater.gov is our kind of team email address. We do monitor that on a daily basis, so that is the best place to reach all of us. We will continue to gather input here. I do appreciate how engaged you all have been so far. We recognize that Douglas is unique, that this is different, and also that it's hard because this is the first time there has been a subsequent AMA. And so we really appreciate the thought that you all are putting into this. And we hope that we'll be able to make something that is sensible and also meets our statutory requirements for this area. With that, we've already done a bunch of our questions, so we are right at 2:58. I will give, let's take just like a 5-minute break so we can get set up for the next piece. And then Brandon will take over and start with the application workshop. Cool. Thank you, everyone.